Before we move on to the discussion of ES6 class syntax and refactor shows app to ES6 class, let's first revise everything that we have talked about in this section. We started our React discussion from a very high level view and tried to understand how we break down our complete user interface by thinking in terms of components. Whole application is broken down to several different components, and these components can also be broken down to further small components. Finally, we compose these smaller components together to create bigger components and ultimately the whole application. Next, we created a very simple primitive element of type h1 using React.createElement function that we used to render hello world heading to the web page. We saw that React.createElement accepts three arguments. First argument is the type of the element like h1, div, etc. Second argument is props or attributes passed to the element. And finally, from third argument onwards, 0 or more children can be provided. That could be a string or React elements themselves. Then we tried to render h1 element on the web page. We saw that we needed to use another library, React DOM, that helps us to render React elements to the DOM as opposed to other platforms, mobile, desktop, etc. We saw that React is just a library that helps us to break down application into several different components and compose them together. On the other hand, renderers like React DOM, React Native make sure that components are rendered to the corresponding platform like browser, mobile, etc. This means that you can learn React once and transfer the same concepts while building native apps for iOS, Android, and other platforms also. Then we saw that as soon as our application starts to grow bigger and bigger, React.createElement doesn't fit well. You need to type more code, and nested elements makes it more difficult to read the code as well. So to fix that problem, React provides us declarative JSX syntax that has familiarity of HTML and power of JavaScript. So instead of writing imperative syntax React.createElement, we moved to its declarative shorthand JSX. JSX is easy to pick as it has familiarity of HTML with some minor differences. Since browser doesn't understand JSX, all calls to JSX are transpiled to React.createElement calls by Babel transpiler. So far, we directly created React elements and rendered them to the web page. But directly creating React elements are of little use as we can't pass input to them dynamically. To do that, we created functional components that are just plain JavaScript functions which return some JSX or React element. We can pass inputs called as props to these functional components just like we pass input to a function. At the end of the day, functional components consumes props and produces React element that eventually render view to the DOM. Then we saw that even though props help us to reuse the component several times, they are immutable or cannot be modified, which makes our web page static. To make our web page dynamic, we needed to introduce state that changes over a period of time. To be able to use that state, we need to create another type of components called as class components. We looked at older create class syntax for now, but in the next section, we are going to look at ES6 class syntax to create components. How we create class components doesn't really matter. What matters is class components allow us to do more than just rendering JSX to the web page. Class is an entity that can bind several methods and state or data inside it. We can create several instances of class called as objects, and each one of them will have its own state. Class components can also be used to send network request, database query, etc. Inside class component, whenever we need to update state of component instance, we have to call a very special method called setState. Difference between class component and functional component is same as of the difference between object-oriented programming and functional programming. Functional components are single entities that can do only one thing, which is to accept props and return JSX. Whereas class can bind multiple items, that is methods and state together, and hence allow us to do more than just rendering JSX on the web page. Then, using class components, we created a very trivial shows app to see how easy it is to build and compose the components in React. Then, we talked a little bit about general programming guideline and discussed imperative and declarative programming. Imperative programming means that we tell program how to do something to achieve a result. And in declarative programming, we are concerned with the result and not worried about how to exactly do that. So in declarative programming, we tell the computer what we want to do as opposed to how to do something. Declarative programming enhances the code readability as we hide all the complexity behind an easy and declarative syntax or API like map. It just presents a simpler interface or abstraction for most of the common problems. Then we talked about composition. Composition is definitely something we do in every programming language. Every programming language has primitive types that we use to create objects that are called as user-defined types. And we combine these objects together to create even bigger objects. That's all we are doing in React as well. We have primitive type elements like h1, div, etc. and we use these primitive types to create components that we call as user-defined components. And we use these components to create bigger components and ultimately the whole application. Finally, we started discussing on React element, component and component instance. Components are like the blueprints of how our application should look like. But component instance is the implementation of that blueprint. Component instances are really just objects that are created from a class component. And each one of these objects or instances has its own state. Class component instance is created by React internally when we tell React to create a React element of that type for the first time. And then React uses the same instance to update it on the web page from the next time onwards. On the other hand, functional components are just invoked by React internally and doesn't have any instance associated with them. Then we discussed that React element is a declarative syntax or interface that allows us to pass props or attributes to the components of all types. That is, class components, functional components and DOM elements. React hides all the complexity of handling different types of components behind the scenes and just asks us to give it a React element object. This way, we can compose DOM elements and user-defined components through a uniform React element or JSX syntax. We are not yet done with React element. I will come back to this topic later when we talk about reconciliation. Finally, I would like to say that these are some of the things that you should keep in mind while writing React code. Even though React.createElement works fine, I doubt if anyone uses it nowadays. So you should use JSX declarative syntax to make the code more readable and easy to write. Next, if you have an idea or mental picture in mind of how your application looks like, then you should divide your application into simpler, granular and reusable components. And finally, prefer declarative programming over imperative programming for common patterns. Declarative code many times is far more readable, much less error prone and easy to use than imperative code. Alright, let's keep going.